I spoke with Dr. Dawkins after long, tentative, and increasingly amicable correspondence beforehand to clarify my ignorance of his well-defended positions, particularly in relationship to his opposition to religious belief and behavior. Suffice it to say, in the latter case, that we have much more to talk about. I greatly enjoyed both opportunities and will be releasing a video recording of the former and an audio of the latter in the very near future. I believe that these conversations went very well. I certainly found them intensely engrossing and informative, and I regard it as another great privilege and opportunity to place them online, where they will be made available to millions of avid listeners around the world. I can do that because I'm a free-speaking citizen of Canada, a member of the British Commonwealth, and except for our own sporadic and inexcusable foolishness, a country shaped to the core by the English common law tradition. Furthermore, I can make those discussions and all my talks and seminars at Oxbridge available on YouTube, the technologically revolutionary platform invented by Americans, who were even at the time of the revolution and are still now in some real sense sovereign British citizens, insisting on their due and intrinsic rights. And what would the world be without the recognition of those rights? A stifling web of intrigue, a system of archaic dynasties, a tribal mess of clans steeped in nepotism, warring with one another for access to the short-term exigencies of power. I realize that there are other lights in the world, apart from the UK and its subsidiaries and once dependents. Although I would argue that even the European countries that profess respect for freedom of speech and thought, in reality, fealty to the divine word, both secular and inescapably religious, have done so in no small part because of the influence of that great land. And the fact that Dr. Dawkins and I came armed, so to speak, with radically different viewpoints and conceptions was a spur to our very productive conversation, and not an impediment. And the fact that such discussions and their dissemination are possible throughout so much of the world, rather than positively forbidden and fatally dangerous, is another one of the reasons I love Great Britain. My talks at both Cambridge and Oxford appeared uniformly welcome to faculty and students alike, with a single exception, a rather courageous and comic young woman dressed in a full-body lobster suit who popped in during my most public talk at Cambridge to shout "Feminism" and dance briefly about. Why was that reception so positive, uniform, and manifold, when I was apparently ignorant and malevolent enough to be banned from the campus only 2 short years ago? The students at Cambridge remained seated when I entered the hall just prior to my first talk, although they had lined up down the block for most of the day beforehand. While the Oxford crowd, anxious as they are not to be outdone, gave me an overwhelmingly moving standing ovation before I spoke there. I say that not in triumph, I hope, as that would be the sort of pride that deservedly invites a fall, although I might need to confess occasionally harboring at least a quizzical smile about such things. Such a public response seems at curious odds with the idea so invidiously insisted upon that I was and am a fundamentally malign person, characterized by literally unacceptable political opinions. The same mode of interaction made itself evident in what were many dozens of encounters with individual students on the streets and in the colleges at Oxbridge. No fear, no disgust, no contempt, no hatred, just a series of extremely inviting, pleasant, and often surprisingly deep and intimate individual encounters with fine, mostly young people, striving with all due effort upward and onward, informing me, forthrightly that they were doing so. Perhaps an inquiring and curious journalist could discuss, among other issues, the fact of my fellowship revocation, the Regent House vote, and the positive response to my presence at Cambridge with the soon-to-depart Vice-Chancellor, another Canadian. We are a pesky and intrusive lot. Professor Stephen Toop, whose precipitous retirement from the glorious UK academic and cultural scene was somewhat synchronistically timed given the aforementioned vote and my subsequent re-invitation. Or perhaps it could be discussed, all of it, with a tiny number of individuals still meddling madly and unrepentantly behind the scenes who orchestrated the whole false thing in the beginning. And the fact that a journalist could inquire about such things is yet another reason why I love Great Britain, with its profound commitment to the idea that the curious have the right to interrogate and investigate those who have been granted authority or usurped power. After our university sojourn, after having been granted access to the original writings of Charles Darwin and Isaac Newton, after attending the most beautiful imaginable choir-accompanied services at the magnificent chapels gracing both institutions, after walking down the hallowed historical halls of higher learning in a setting constantly overwhelming and remarkable for a mere colonial accustomed to history on a much more minor scale, my wife and I were privileged to tour the British Parliament, accompanied by one of the peers of the realm. She was great, if I might be so bold to say so. Everything a hopeful outsider, uncorrupted by the pervasive cynicism that corrupts our time, might have wished for. Kind, charitable, engaging, unpretentious, articulate, elegant, and possessed of that wonderful accent, bestowing upon its possessor the immediate impression of high intelligence. In the Palace of Westminster, I stopped for a moment at the precise center of the heart of that remarkable building and lifted my eyes upwards, directly under the immense chandelier suspended under the beautiful and ornate domed octagonal ceiling. I understood then that I was standing at the base of the realization in stone, wood, and the air itself of the cosmic tree, Yggdrasil itself, the liana joining heaven and earth, the object of the most ancient of sacred visions and religious transports, the very lifeline between the transcendent heavens above and the suffering and fallen earth itself. If I could have asked for something more to befall me at that moment, it would have been the music of the divine to accompany that vision. Perhaps Bach's great Third Brandenburg Concerto, although I would have settled for the British national anthem, God Save the Queen. That lobby is most certainly not the untrustworthy, corrupt, and damnable site of power, dominance, and oppression, but the very place where the practical redemption of a great people is continually undertaken, governed by the transcendent and necessary principle of the unalienable right to express the logos as conscience, soul, and rationality itself dictate. That lobby, enshrined in that palace, the cardinal castle of the Word, has been a very light unto the world, realized there simultaneously in stone, tradition, and living action. It is the very place where the sovereign voice of the people meets the voice of its representatives, to be carried forth into its eventual incarnation into the body of laws we separately and jointly accept, adopt, and act out. We are all carriers of the temptation to resentment and the desire to compel and force those who disagree with our presumptions, that poses an eternal threat to the integrity of our souls and our societies. We are all possessed by the attributes of the Auschwitz capo, the Gulag trustee, the willingness to turn away and to consciously deceive, and the capacity to delight in oppression and cruelty. We are each and all of us tainted by the blood that soaks our soil. But the people of Great Britain have granted the world a gift whose power stands in permanent opposition to our most appalling proclivities as individuals and societies. That gift is the political expression of the sanctification of the word, freedom in speech, imagination, and thought. Freedom to engage in the very process that builds and rebuilds habitable order itself from the chaos that eternally surrounds us. And that freedom is expressed in many ways, small and great, in the British Isles, in the wit of its people, in the effectiveness of its institutions, in the beauty of its art and literature, in the political and psychological presumptions that guide private discourse and public conception and action. And that is most particularly why I love Great Britain. And that is why people of that realm, and not only of that realm, you should love her too, despite her sins. With your eyes lifted upward, your hope to the future, and the word of truth and faith on your tongues. I love your country. Rule Britannia indeed.